Welcome to this explainer. Today we're looking at the Congo Free State, an era of history that's honestly as fascinating as it is deeply tragic. We're going to investigate exactly how one European monarch's supposedly humanitarian mission morphed into one of the most deadly systems of economic exploitation in human history. By digging into the hard facts and the actual mechanics of this colonial enterprise, we'll uncover how a devastation of this sheer magnitude was allowed to happen, all while hiding behind the guise of charity. Okay, let's kick things off with a pretty staggering number, 85. Back in the late 19th century, King Leopold II of Belgium claimed a Central African territory that was literally 85 times the size of his own country. We're talking about the equatorial heart of the African continent, an area of over 1 million square miles. For a country as small as Belgium, this was just an unfathomably huge acquisition. And it was all driven by one man's relentless ambition to secure a colonial empire, especially at a time when most Belgian politicians were looking at overseas colonies and thinking, yeah, no thanks, that's way too risky and expensive. Now, this massive land grab was initially sold to the whole world as an act of profound charity, which brings us to a huge question. How on earth did a philanthropic mission devolve into such unimaginable horror? Well, to figure that out, we really have to look right past the surface-level narratives of the era and dig into the specific economic and political structures that Leopold actually put into place.
Section 1. A philanthropic facade.
What's really wild here is the stark contrast between Leopold's public PR and the private truth. Publicly, he hosted the 1876 Brussels Geographic Conference, created the International African Association, and told European leaders his only goals were scientific exploration, anti-slavery efforts, and bringing quote-unquote civilization to the Congo Basin. And it worked. He actually convinced the major powers at the Berlin Conference in 1884 to recognize his control over the supposedly independent Congo Free State as a completely free trade zone. But privately, totally different story. In a letter to his envoy, he basically laid out his true profit-driven ambition, saying he absolutely did not want to miss a chance to secure a slice of this magnificent African cake. So let's be clear, this wasn't a Belgian state colony. It was essentially Leopold's own massive, privately owned corporate state. Section 2, the red rubber system. So how did he extract that profit? Well, the turning point came surprisingly fast. After the state was officially recognized in 1885, it was actually struggling financially. Ivory exports just weren't covering the massive bills, and Leopold was teetering right on the edge of bankruptcy. But then, right around 1890, the inflatable rubber tire was invented. This was a total game changer. It triggered an absolutely massive global boom in the demand for natural rubber. And guess what? The Congo rainforest was practically overflowing with wild rubber vines. It was basically a miraculous financial rescue for Leopold's bank accounts, but it became an absolute death sentence for the Congolese. To really cash in on this rubber boom, Leopold instituted a radical policy shift known as the domain system. Through a series of decrees in 1891 and 1892, he essentially declared that all vacant or uncultivated land, and crucially, everything growing on it, including all that highly valuable rubber and ivory, belonged directly to the state. Boom. The promise of free trade completely dead. He then turned around and handed out these massive land concessions to private companies like the Anglo-Belgian India Rubber Company, while keeping a huge crown domain strictly for himself. And the financial results of that policy shift were just explosive. Because the state and these private companies now owned all the resources, they slapped a tax on the native population that had to be paid in labor, specifically by harvesting wild rubber. Thanks to this forced labor, state domain revenue completely skyrocketed from a meager 150,000 francs in 1890 to a staggering 18 million francs by 1901. Private companies were literally seeing 100% profit turnovers in a single year. It was a ridiculously lucrative cash cow, but it was built 100% on coercion. Section 3. Instruments of terror. Now, extracting that much profit required serious muscle, which brings us to the Force Publique. The crucial takeaway here is that this wasn't just your standard military. Sure, they fought wars to consolidate territory, but their primary day-to-day function, they operated as a ruthless corporate police force. You had a few hundred white European officers commanding thousands of conscripted African soldiers, and they were dispatched across the territory for one main reason: to enforce the rubber tax. The actual mechanics of this system were just horrific. Gathering rubber from these vines was incredibly painful and time-consuming, so obviously the native population resisted. How did the state and the companies respond? With systematic, organized terror. They would literally take women and children hostage, locking them up in stockades until the men of the village returned from the jungle with enough rubber. They utilized the shakot, which was this dreaded whip made of sun-dried hippopotamus hide that left permanent scars and could easily kill a person. And if a village failed to meet its quota, punitive expeditions were sent in to burn the entire village to the ground and execute anyone who dissented. And we know about all of this not just from modern hindsight, but from actual eyewitnesses who were there at the time. Take Stanislas Lefrant, a Belgian magistrate who actually tried to protest the use of the shikot. He documented the sheer brutality of the system, describing how even little kids, 7 or 8 years old, were publicly beaten for minor perceived offenses. He protested to his superiors, but he was just mocked and ignored. It really shows you just how deeply normalized this extreme violence was within the whole colonial administration. But perhaps the most infamous, chilling symbol of this terror was the severed hand. As this quote from an Allied chief, reported by missionary William Shepherd in 1899, makes painfully clear, soldiers had to prove they weren't wasting their expensive imported ammunition on hunting or hoarding it for mutiny. So they were required to provide a severed right hand for every single bullet they used. In practice, if a soldier missed a shot, they might literally cut the hand off of a living person just to balance their tally. Baskets of smoked hands were routinely brought back to officers as proof of enforcement. It essentially became a morbid currency within the Free State. Section 4. A staggering death toll. The direct fallout of this unrelenting extraction was an absolute demographic catastrophe. When we look at why so many people died, it wasn't just direct murder and punitive violence, although those were obviously rampant. The forced labor system completely shattered the local economy and agriculture. With the men forced into the forests to gather rubber, and the women either held hostage or trying to desperately farm exhausted fields, the region was hit by massive famines and completely plummeting birth rates. Because the population was starving, exhausted, and constantly displaced, they had zero defenses against imported epidemic diseases like sleeping sickness and smallpox. Those diseases just swept through the territory, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives. So what was the final toll? Well, it's a massive range, anywhere from 1.2 million to an almost unfathomable 10 million people. Because the Congo Free State never bothered to conduct an official census, the first one didn't happen until 1924 under actual Belgian rule, historians have to rely on estimates, oral histories, and regional data. And while demographers do heavily debate the exact figure, pointing out the natural fluctuations of pre-colonial populations, let's be real. Even the most conservative estimates represent a loss of life that is honestly difficult for the human mind to process. This incredible loss of life brings up a huge ongoing debate among historians. Legally speaking, does this constitute genocide? Under the 1948 UN definition, genocide requires the intent to destroy a specific group. And most historians point out that Leopold's intent wasn't deliberate extermination, right? He wanted a living labor force to extract rubber, not a dead one. But at the end of the day, the sheer scale of the slaughter, the absolute systemic ruthlessness of the economic exploitation, and the total indifference to human life has led many experts to refer to it as a hecatomb, a Holocaust-scale catastrophe. Section 5. Exposure and Legacy. So, how did the world finally uncover the truth? Leopold's whole philanthropic veil was eventually pierced by some incredibly brave early whistleblowers. Way back in 1890, an American named George Washington Williams wrote an open letter where he actually coined the phrase crimes against humanity to describe exactly what he was witnessing. Then, by the early 1900s, an activist named E.D. Morrill noticed something incredibly suspicious. Ships were leaving Europe for the Congo loaded with nothing but guns and ammunition, and returning stuffed full of highly valuable rubber. He realized right then that it was a slave system and kicked off a massive international pressure campaign. Combined with the explosive 1904 casement report that fully detailed the atrocities, the international outrage just became too much to ignore. By 1908, the Belgian government was completely forced to step in, stripping Leopold of his personal ownership and officially annexing the territory as the Belgian-Congo. Now, what you really should take away from all this is that while the 1908 annexation did end the worst of the Free State's abuses, the deep scars of that era are still incredibly potent today. Over a century later, this history is still driving massive global debates. I mean, just recently in 2020, statues of King Leopold II were vandalized and taken down across Belgium during anti-racism protests. That exact same year, King Philippe of Belgium sent a totally historic letter to the Congolese president expressing his deepest regret for the violence and cruelty of the colonial period, though, of course, debates are still raging on whether full institutional apologies are owed. So as we reflect on this incredibly dark chapter, we want to leave you with a final question to ponder. How do we measure the true cost of progress and economic booms when they are built on a foundation of hidden, unimaginable human exploitation? We hope this explainer has given you a much clearer understanding of the structures operating behind the Congo Free State. Thanks so much for joining us, and keep questioning the history behind the headlines.